Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on when you're tuning in. My name is Glen Springfield, and welcome to another episode of the Business Building Success Show. Today, I have something very, very important to discuss, and that is the subject of motivation. Where does motivation come from? When we're feeling unmotivated, how can we flip a switch to then feel more motivated? If our staff is unmotivated, what do we do to help them be more motivated to motivate them? And it's an interesting subject because I just came out of a staff meeting where going around the table, a bunch of people that I care for a lot, and we're discussing this subject. And from a psychological standpoint, where motivation comes from, I want to explain that first, because it is understanding this makes success possible. And not understanding this makes success almost impossible. And so it's a very, very important subject. So success, motivation, begins with a vision, which is, what do you want? Okay, here's what you want. It's up here. But you also have to have a clear understanding of where you are. So here is where you are. So you've got current reality right here, and then you've got the vision of what you want. Now, if the vision of what you want is a wish, if it is a desire, if it's something that you really, would kind of enjoy, if that's the level of desire, then that's not going to provide motivation to get you from here to here. Now, let me give you an example. And say that a person is accustomed to making $50,000 a year. That's how much they're used to making. Well, if all of a sudden, for some reason, $50,000 is what they're used to, but if all of a sudden their income drops to like $30,000, how do they feel about the $30,000 when they're used to making $50,000? Well, they're very, very uncomfortable. And that discomfort will create the motivation and the creativity to get them back to where they ought to be. So that's kind of the secret here in motivation, is you can have a vision of what you want, but if you cannot add enough emotion and enough intensity to make what you want what ought to be, this is the way it ought to be, this is what's good enough for me, this is what's good enough for my family. If you can't take your desire and get it to that level emotionally, then you're not going to have the motivation created by the gap between what your current reality is and how you think things ought to be. If it's not at that level, you won't have the motivation. But if you do have that, if you have it in your mind, if you visualized it intensely and added emotion to it, and it's not just a wish, it's this is the way it ought to be. If you have that level of desire and visualization and to get there, the way that you get there is through a process. It's through a process of, first of all, what would I like, and then imagining it a lot. Let's say that you're unhappy with your car and you see a particular car that you like. Well, at first, that's you look at your car, you look at that car, and boy, that's kind of a nice car. I'd like to have that. Well, then you notice another one, and then that desire increases. Boy, that's a really sharp-looking car. Then you see another one, then you see another one, then you see another one. So your mind is opening up, and it's creating increased importance towards this thing that you want. And after a while, then the desire is so intense that you go, well, that's what I ought to have. And once you get it up to the fact, well, that's what I ought to have, this is the way it ought to be, well, then your subconscious mind, your conscious mind, parts of the minds that filter out information or let information in, all of that changes, and you figure out creatively, you figure out how to get to that ought to, what ought to be level. And pretty soon, you're driving the new car. And you've probably experienced this a number of times in different areas of your life. But this doesn't have to be like an accidental thing. You can intentionally do it. What do you want? Why do you want it? Why is that important? Invest time in thinking about it over and over and over again. And the more you think about it, then you're elevating its importance. And when it gets to the point where you've invested enough mental energy in figuring out what ought to be, what's good enough for you, what's good enough for your business, what's good enough for your staff, when it gets to that what's good enough level, then you've got this current reality and you've got what's good enough in this gap, right? Well, then your mind will go to work on figuring out how to get from where you are to where you ought to be. Not where you want to be, not where you wish you could be, but it's where you ought to be. So the way that you get yourself motivated is figure out what you want and then figure out why you want it and then think about why that's the minimum for the way things ought to be. Why is that the minimum of what's good enough for you, what's good enough for your family, what's good enough for your business, what's good enough for your staff? Why that level? Why is that level important? If you don't know the why, and if it's not really important, if it's just words, this isn't going to work at all. But if you want it for good reasons, and the reasons are good for your family, good for you, good for everybody involved, then you just sit back and watch. You just keep visualizing it. And this gap that is discomfort, it is cognitive dissonance is the psychological term. This cognitive dissonance from where you are currently, your perception of reality, to your perception of what's good enough, what things ought to be, that gap is what creates the motivation. So, hope this helps. In fact, I don't hope it helps. I know it'll help. If you will invest time in yourself, take time and figure out what you want and why you want it, what's good enough for you, and then take an honest look at current reality to where now you're using the gap. You got current reality, this is good enough, this is not good enough. You just watch how creative and inventive you can be, and your motivation will not be, rah-rah, trying to, get yourself psyched up. Yay, yay, yay. It's not that kind of motivation. No, it's like, how do I get from where I am to where I ought to be? And you do it all the time naturally whenever you're used to something being at this level, and then all of a sudden situations change and now you're at this level, right? You're down below. Well, then you figure out how to do. You're in a job, job's going fine, you like the job, you like your income, you get fired. Well, being unemployed, that's not good enough. So then you quickly figure out how to solve that problem. Okay? So many life events can affect us, but we automatically correct. Like, for instance, if you take a guy that's financially free, he's a millionaire, and then he loses all of his money. Well, that's a gap. I'm used to being wealthy. Now I'm not wealthy, but I know I should be wealthy. Well, then his mind will invariably figure out how to get back to where he was, to get back to where he knows where he ought to be. On the other hand, you take somebody that wins the lottery, and before they were poor, now they've got millions of dollars. Well, even though they have the money, they know where they ought to be. They find themselves here, but they know they belong down here. Invariably, within 3 to 5 years, they've blown all the money, because the gap between where they figured they should be, where they belong, the gap between where they belong and where they were, that gap caused them to move towards and get back to where they thought they should be. So where should you be? Where should you be in your business? Where should you be in your income? Where should you be in your relationships? Where should you be in your physical fitness and in your health? Where should you be? And see, when you tune in and you start writing down what you want, why you want it, spend some time, invest some time in thinking about it and letting that visualization kind of marinate in your mind, then you just keep doing that. And without getting rah-rah, without, trying to be anything more than what you are, your incredible genius brain will figure out how to close the gap. But you got to create the gap. You got to know what you want, why you want it. Then you got to take a realistic, real-life look at where you are right now. And that gap is what's going to give you the motivation to accomplish whatever you want in business, personal life, whatever. So, hope this helps. Thank you for tuning in. If you liked what I told you, if you heard something that kind of resonates, then leave me a comment, share an experience, subscribe to the channel. If you don't want to miss any episodes, then be sure and click the notification bell. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Business Building Success Show. This is Glen Springfield. Goodbye.